So one of the things we've talked about before is that air masses, there's a few different types of air masses. Air masses are going to take on the characteristics of the land they sit over or the ocean that they sit over. So we're really looking, when we talk about air masses, we define them by two different ways, by their relative temperature and by their relative humidity or moisture. Okay, that's as simple as we define them. Then, when two or more air masses come together, they do not mix. Okay, different air masses of different temperature and humidity don't mix. So boundaries form between them. Boundaries are called fronts. That's what we're going to look at right now. Okay, let's start off with showing what we call the source areas for different air masses. Okay, so let's start out here in the northwest. This is out over the North Pacific Ocean. Okay, if you're an air mass, you've been hanging out over the North Pacific Ocean for days or weeks, are you going to be warm or cold? Cold. You're going to be cold. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to look at. The temperature of an air mass is the first little symbol that we give it for cold when we define air masses. Actually, it's a second symbol. For cold, we use a capital P, and that stands for polar. All right? Now, you're that same air mass out over here over the North Pacific. How about your moisture content? And you only have two choices. Are you moist or are you dry? You're hanging out over an ocean. You're moist, okay? Now, we use the term maritime for that. And we actually just condense this. We call this little m, big P air. This is called maritime polar air. Now, these blue arrows are going to show you the direction it tends to move. So in other words, it starts here, but then it will move over western North America, and in many cases just continue right across. Now here comes the tricky part. Maritime polar air, okay, comes in off the Pacific, and then let's say it's out over the southwest for many days, even a week or so. Now it's hanging out over a dry desert area. What do you suppose happens to that air mass? It changes. It gets modified. So we can also have what we call modified MP air. And we get a lot of that. As a matter of fact, we've had modified MP air over us for quite a while now. All right? So even though it started off as MP air, came over land, it starts drying out and warming up. That's what happens to it. It's still what we would call modified maritime polar air because we're really concerned with where it came from. All right, that's maritime polar. Let's go up here in the subarctic, Arctic, Canada. CP air. Now, anytime you see the P, that's going to be polar. All right, cold. So obviously, air that sits over northern Canada is going to be cold. Now, remember that first small letter is going to be an indication of is it moist or is it dry. So what do you think? Moist or dry air that spends time over that area? It's going to be dry. That C stands for continental. So that would be, I'll just write that word here, continental. And that's CP air, okay? So the characteristics of CP air are that it's dry, and these are the very cold air masses. You see the blue arrows that come down. Generally, we don't get a lot of CP air coming west of the Rockies. The Rocky Mountains that would lie approximately in this area right here tend to form a physical barrier to this cold, dense air that comes down. I'm not saying it can't, because you can see it will occasionally, but most of the continental polar air comes down, will hit the Rockies, and it slides back this way, also because we have the prevailing westerlies coming across here. So we actually here in Arizona have a couple of things going for us so we don't get into this very cold air. And that is, like I say, number one, the physical barrier of the Rocky Mountains, but also the fact that most of the time our air is blowing from west to east. It keeps this air out of here. Having said that, however, we do get continental polar air coming down here occasionally. What's the all-time record low temperature for Prescott, Arizona? Well, come on. Okay, how cold did it get this winter? What was the coldest temperature you guys saw this winter?
6.
I saw 6. That's the coldest I've recorded. So is that it? Was that our record low? So take a guess. Come on, Callie.
-14.
You're close. 21 below zero. That's your all-time record low here. That's pretty cold. I was kind of surprised when I looked those records up when I first moved here. But anyway, that means you will occasionally get continental polar air coming down into this area.
When was that?
I'd have to look at my door. It's on my door and my bulletin board. I did know what year it was. It was quite a while ago. I know that. Okay, so we talked about maritime polar air, continental polar air. Now you see something else up here. Okay, I don't differentiate between the two, but you know some people do. So for your interest, this is continental Arctic air. Okay, and there's really no difference. I mean, it's the same air. It's cold, it's dry, and it's dense. So I don't use CA air, but you know, like I say, some people do. And one of the reasons you see the source area right here on the Alaska-Yukon border, coincidentally, that's where the coldest temperature in North America ever occurred. So anybody know what the coldest temperature we've ever recorded in North America? Take a wild guess. What's the coldest temperature ever recorded? And it would be attributed to continental Arctic air.
-45.
That's a good guess. Actually, -81. And so it was fairly good guess. It was right here. It was actually just in the Yukon side of the border. It's a little town called Snag, Yukon. How about the lower 48? Coldest temperature ever recorded here, and that would have been continental Arctic air. It's not bad. It's like -73 up here in western Montana. That's cold, -73. You know, this year we had a lot of very cold air that came down into the eastern half of the country. You may have heard this. I saw temperatures in Minnesota this winter at 60 below zero. 60 below zero in Minnesota this year. So anyway, really cold. All right, enough of the cold air. Let's talk about this area out here. Okay, relatively warm ocean surface here. So think about it. If you're an air mass hanging out there, you're going to have what attributes? What about temperature? Warm. So you see a big T there. The big T stands for tropical. The little m stands for the same thing it did up here. So we're talking about maritime tropical air. Okay, and that would be called little m, big T air. And we get a lot of it, because look at all the different source areas. We have the southern Pacific Ocean, we have the Gulf of Mexico, and we have the South Atlantic Ocean. All of these are very warm bodies, okay? And it will spread air. You can see the directions it tends to go, okay? Now, I hadn't talked about the East Coast, but we also have maritime polar air that will occasionally do this backdoor retrograde motion back into the United States. It does happen sometimes. But most of the MP air comes across from the Pacific and will literally cross the entire United States. Now, here's a specialty one, okay? What do those letters mean? Continental Tropical Air, and it's a summer phenomenon only. What happens here, and when we talk about the southwest monsoon later on, you're going to see this is associated with the southwest monsoon. It really creates our southwest monsoon. What happens is in the summertime, by July, at the sun, when it gets at its highest angle, that'll be June 21st, but July it's still very high. Remember we talked about solar intensity. The ground heats up to its maximum in this area. This very hot ground heats the air above it, and we get almost a continuous thermal plume. In other words, this plume of air that continues to rise over the southwest. What that does, that thermal plume, think about it, if we're taking air off the surface, we're creating lower pressure down here. Lower pressure at the surface causes air to flow in from all around it. When the air flowing in comes from, say, the Gulf of Mexico, this really warm, moist air, that warm, moist air moves up, rises in the plume, develops all these cumulonimbus clouds. We get our thunderstorms. That's our monsoon. So it only occurs in the summertime here. We're going to do a case study on that in about a week, so you'll learn a lot more about the southwest monsoon here. But this is unique on the planet. No other place on the planet gets the kind of monsoon that we get, okay? So again, continental tropical air only associated during the height of summer when the ground is at its temperature maximum. Okay? All right, so those are your source areas for air masses in North America.